Hi there, and thanks for joining us once again on Unstoppable Mindset. I'm your host, Mike Hinkson, and I wish you a pleasant day wherever you happen to be. Today, we get to talk with James Davis, and he has got a great story to tell, a challenging story at times, but I think a very inspirational story. He has been through a lot, he's helped a lot of people, and I met him through Accessibe, in fact. He has been working with our nonprofit partner, Sheldon Lewis, who we got to interview on the podcast, a long time ago now. And so Sheldon suggested that we should chat. We have, and James agreed to come on the podcast. So James, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, we're really pleased and honored that you were able to join us. So tell us a little bit about you growing up. I love to start that way and just kind of let people talk about their world growing up. And I know you've had a pretty big challenge, so I'll leave it to you.
Well, I was born in East St. Louis, and I grew up in that area around St. Louis most of my life. And so I'm a Midwest boy, and moved around a lot, didn't stay in any particular place for any length of time. And my mom went through several marriages, and so I had some challenges with that. And
What year were you born?
66.
Okay, well, I beat you by a few years. I was born in Chicago in 1950, so Midwest also. I moved to California when I was 5, but my wife constantly told me, no matter what, you weren't here for your first 5 years, so you're not a native.
I did live in California for a couple of years when I was apparently from about 18 months old to about 2.5, 3 years old, something like that. My mom said, in Santa Barbara.
Oh, well, that's a great place to live.
Yeah. And, it's actually my earliest memory because I remember my dad pulling alongside this rocky area next to a beach, and he wanted to show me something. So he grabbed a flashlight. It was getting dark, and we went down to the beach, and he looked underneath these rocks and pulled out a little crab, and which I thought was just great, And so then he said, watch this. And he carried me back up to the car and proceeded to scare my mother and my older sister half to death with this crab. And that's my earliest memory in life. And it's probably also where I get my ornery sense of humor as well.
Well, having an ornery sense of humor isn't the big problem, but that was kind of cruel to do. But What happened to the crab?
He put it back, and then we left.
Oh, okay.
All I can remember. It was just a little rock crab or something.
Yeah. Well, so you moved around a fair amount, obviously, and so on, and eventually you went to high school and went to college and all that?
Yes. So my dad died when I was 16. He was killed in a bar. And then, for about a year or so there, I was in just self-destruct mode, and dropped out of school. And then my mom got with a guy that was an alcoholic. So I ended up leaving home. And I think I was about 16 when that happened, almost 17. So I kind of lived on the streets for a while. And then my mom came to me and said, let's move to Colorado, because she was wanting to get away from this guy. And so I agreed. And and that moved sort of changed my life at that point. And I got back into school and finished high school and went on to college.
What did you major in?
I ended up majoring in history, which is a little ironic because I hated history in high school. But what I realized was what I hated about history in high school was it was always my football coaches that were teaching the history, and they didn't care much about history. There was no passion behind it. They were all about the football. And so when I got to college, the professors, they were passionate about it, and I realized what a fascinating topic it was. And so I just fell in love with history.
You just made me think of the fact that a couple of days ago we interviewed musician Kenny Aronoff, and Kenny is a drummer and grew up not really excited about rock, playing in classical orchestras and so on, and then decided he didn't really like classical nearly as much as rock and more modern music, and so he switched and has been extremely successful. But I hear what you're saying. You know, sometimes our attitudes change in one way or another. So you like history today?
Oh yeah, I love history. I favorite is the Bronze Age, so I
Hmm.
like ancient history.
Now, why do you like the Bronze Age?
You know, it's when civilization was really sort of coming into its own. And I find that very fascinating. It was a big melting pot, especially in the Mediterranean region. Uh, and so what really got me into it was how religion, how they adopted each other's deities into each other's regions and just sort of co-opted them. And it's just a very fascinating development to me, how all that came about.
Then Christianity came along and sort of messed up the whole deity thing a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, threw a monkey wrench in there for sure.
Well, you know, on the other hand, we do progress, and there's value in doing that and growing and recognizing hopefully what God's about. But that's of course another whole story.
Yeah.
So, what did you do after college?
So I did start teaching uh, history at some high schools out there in Colorado. I was living in Colorado at the time, and because of what happened in my youth, I was really wanting to go to these at-risk youth centers, like Job Corps, and there was a place called R5 where I also graduated from, and I started working there with them as well. And so, yeah, that's what I just started teaching. I just loved it.
Yeah, um, it's it's extremely rewarding, and I've always been of the opinion that teachers never get paid or rewarded nearly enough for the work that they do. So I have a secondary teaching credential, but jobs took me in other directions. So I haven't taught professionally, as it were. But I think that in a lot of ways, I've always been teaching. So I appreciate what you're saying. So how long did you teach, or do you still?
No, I forced retirement, so to speak, in 2009. I was having I'd been having for several years some problems, some health problems, and I wasn't sure what was going on. And it really sort of came to a head around 2009. And the brain fog that I was experiencing was so severe that I really was struggling to keep dates and times and names in my head. And so it wasn't good for me to be a teacher in my mind because I wasn't able to present the material properly to the students. At least that's what I was thinking in my head, and it's probably true. So I just quit, and then I struggled for a couple of years in depression and all of that, trying to figure out. I thought I was dying. I mean, I was so sick that I couldn't even get out of bed some days, and I never knew any sort of illness that would do this, and doctors had no idea. I go to them, every few months trying to figure this out, but there was nothing. So I just put me into a really deep depression.
What happened?
Well, I was the biggest part of my depression. It was twofold. One, chronic pain, and the chronic illness itself was very hard to deal with on a daily basis. And then the other thing was it's not being able to contribute to our household, my wife and the kids. The kids were old enough to move out at that point, but I was just wasn't in a good place, and I just couldn't see a path forward. And plus, thinking that I'm going to die anytime anyway because I was so sick, that I decided to take it on myself to do it myself. So I made a plan, and I was going to just end the suffering of all this and let my wife move on. But I knew I couldn't do it without talking it over with her first, because she is such a sensitive person that she would have thought that it was her fault that I did this. And I just couldn't do that to her. So I set her down. I thought she would be sympathetic because she knew how sick I was. And she wasn't very sympathetic. She was actually quite mad at me. And so anyway, we talked, and she made me promise not to do anything until we had exhausted all of the medical avenues that we could. And so that started me on another journey of trying to figure out what was wrong with me.
And that sounds like it took a while to really figure out.
Yeah, I wasn't diagnosed until 2013, and it happened by accident. I was trying to figure out what I could do to bring some income into our house, because I knew I couldn't do anything physical. But, I had some pretty good computer skills, and, and I had my education. So I was like, I'm just scouring the internet trying to find something I could do, as I'm able to do it. And I ran across this blog from a young man in Great Britain, or the UK. And as I was reading it, he was talking about how he had become a writer because of his illness. And I thought, oh, this is promising. And then he started going through all the problems that he was suffering. And I was just going down and reading every single one of the things that he was talking about that I had, except for like one out of like 15 symptoms. And I was like, wow, that can't be a coincidence. So I took that information, and he said he had ME, and I took all this to my doctor, and I said, what do you think? He's like, I don't know, I've never heard of it. So he sent me to Denver University Hospital, and I went over there, and they did a battery of tests and sent me back and said I had myalgic encephalomyelitis, and that was the turning point for me, I guess.
So what is ME?
Good question. They don't know for sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that they know about it, but they don't know the actual cause for certain.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, it's believed that it was from the Epstein-Barr virus, and that triggered a post-viral thing, which happens to a lot of people. Some people's it's one of the herpes simplex viruses, and but it seems to be a post-viral illness, not that different from long COVID. Symptoms are very similar. And they've also, with all this research they've been doing, they've just also discovered that Epstein-Barr virus is also associated with multiple sclerosis. And there might be a connection with that disease as well, which has a similar set of symptoms. So to me, and, this is just my personal view, it seems to be some sort of post-viral illness. And if it's not treated early, caught early and treated early, I haven't heard of anybody actually recovering from it if they hadn't caught it early. But, it causes severe fatigue, what they call PENI or PEM. Sometimes it's a post exhaustion malaise or post exhausted. I'm horrible with these acronyms.
Yeah.
It's an exhaustion from anything. It doesn't have to be physical. It could be stress, and it causes exhaustion. And that's one of the key things: chronic pain, muscle pain, joint pain. It causes problems with the endocrine system, so our immune system's slightly off. T cells don't function quite well. The mitochondria doesn't produce the right energy. That's one of the big things that they're trying to figure out. So there's a lot of little things, and it's just basically a complete system. Everything in your system is off, not by a whole lot, but by enough to make everything feel horrible.
So once they diagnosed that in you, what were they able to do, or what were you able to do about it?
So there's no treatment per se. There's no cure. There's not a whole lot they can do except treat symptoms. So, I was put on some pain pills for the chronic pain, and and then I developed diabetes in that process because my endocrine system was stressed, and so treated me for that. And so they just treat you for the symptoms that you have. And then but then I started doing my own research, and because my doctor, he admitted he knew nothing about the disease, but he was willing to try anything. So I appreciated that. And so I got on the internet, started searching, and I bumped into some forums on Facebook that had information. So what I started to do was some antioxidants. So I do a morning antioxidant shake, with my green tea and some reishi and mushrooms and stuff, and I put all that together, and that's how I start my day. Is trying to get the anti-inflammatories into my body. So that's been a big help, and make sure. The other biggest thing that is getting rest, because sleep deprivation could be a really serious problem for people with ME. So those two things really changed the quality of my life.
So I assume you still, though, do experience chronic pain and so on, or are you able to deal with most of it?
Yeah, the chronic pain thing has been troublesome because of the opioids, of course.
Yeah.
So I've been taking them for 12 years or more, and actually more, 14 years. So at one point when I went to my doctor, I said, he kept bumping up my dosage, and I was at 10 milligrams. So I was like, it's I don't want to keep going down that path, because the efficacy is going to fade, and I don't want to keep taking more of this medicine. So he sent me to a neurologist, and the neurologist started me on 3 different pain pills that I would rotate every 3 weeks. So it was the Vicodin equivalent, Oxy, and I forget what the third one was. And so I was doing that, and I did that for a very brief time, and I realized that I was getting dependent on it in a way that was very unhealthy. And so I took myself off of it. And from that point on, I realized I had to manage it myself. So what I've learned over the years, so I don't end up getting an addiction problem, is I just take the minimal amount that I need just to get through the really rough patches. So I only take it when my pain gets above a 5, and at no other time. I never take it more than 2 or 3 days at a time. So I've had to manage that aspect of it quite a bit.
Have you found any kind of natural remedies, or not necessarily Western medicine kinds of things that help, or have you looked into any of that?
I have. I've tried marijuana, both ingesting it and smoking it, and it just wasn't effective for me. I know a lot of people, it does help, but for me, it didn't. All it did was made me sleepy, so it just made me non-functional. And they tried me on some stuff like Lyrica and gabapentin, which aren't opioid based, but the Lyrica ended up making me horribly violent. It's just the weirdest thing, because I'm a very passive kind of person. And I remember the day I sort of just had this epiphany of what was going on as I was sitting there watching some television. And I had this large dog. He was, tall, about 90 pounds. And whenever he wanted to go to the bathroom, he would walk up and lay his head on my lap. And when he did that, I just had this urge to strike at him. And I loved my pet. I would never hit my pet. And that freaked me out. And I realized that it was the medicine. So I had to get off of that. And it was helping some. And so that was a benefit, but the side effects were just too much. I'm trying to think some of the other stuff I've tried. Magnesium helps a lot with my cramping, muscle cramps, and some of the muscle pain. So I do some magnesium. but I can't take any of the B vitamins. I have this weird thing that when I take certain vitamins, it causes a really bad brain fog to occur. And I'm not sure why that's not that common. It's just something weird with me, I guess. So I've been very limited, but I try stuff all the time. I've got a whole cabinet over there of supplements and stuff that I try.
Well, but through all of it, you obviously didn't go off and execute the plan that you were going to execute. And I'll bet your wife is pretty happy about that.
Yes, yes. We ended up moving out to the Pacific Northwest. We live in Washington now. And that has been a bit of a game changer for me. I feel revitalized. It's a new area. It's beautiful here. The country is just gorgeous. And so whenever I'm able, we take these little trips, an hour here, a couple hours here, and just check out new parks and whatever, beaches and all these beautiful locations. And that led me getting back into photography. I was in photography when I was really young. I lived with a photographer for a while. And so I got back into photography, and having that creative outlet has been wonderful, especially for countering depression. Because along with the depression from this illness, for my entire life, I've had seasonal affective disorder. So in the wintertime, it gets really brutal for me. And that photography and those creative outlets I've found, and some lights, some of those daylight stuff, I use all of those techniques, and it keeps me in a better place.
So, are you still married? Is all that working out, or?
Yeah, I still with my wife, and
that's great.
Yeah, she's a manager at an apartment complex, and they've allowed me to work part-time, 10, 15 hours a week, just doing some maintenance stuff. Like I take care of their security cameras for them, more computer tech stuff. And so I'm able to contribute a little something to our little home here.
Well, the thing that comes to mind is clearly in some senses, you're different, right? You have what people would classify, and I assume that you would also agree it's classified as a disability. And as I tell people, disability does not mean lack of ability, it's a characteristic. And I've made the case on this podcast many times that not one single person on this planet is without a disability. The problem for most people is they're light dependent, and you don't do well when it gets dark. Some of us don't have that problem, but you are different. How does that affect both how you look at yourself or how people treat you? What kind of biases and stuff do you encounter because you do have chronic pain and the things that you have?
I think the most difficult part of having ME is people only see you when you have the energy and ability to get out and about. And so they're only seeing you at your very best. They don't see you when you come home and you're in bed for 3 days afterwards, right? They don't experience that part of your life. So there's this tendency of people believing that there's nothing wrong with you. And I know when ME first started being diagnosed, more broadly, it was mostly women. I think somewhere around 70% or more people diagnosed with the illness is women. And so there was a tendency to treat women as that it was all in their head. We have this, especially, 40 years ago, it was very prevalent in the medical community. If they couldn't diagnose something, that it had to be a mental issue. And so that's been a huge problem there. And then for me, I know the men that have ME, I just recently, like a year or two ago, joined a men's forum on Facebook. And it really hit home how isolated men become because, especially men of my age, we're taught that you're supposed to be the provider for your family, and you have to be the protector and all of these things. You have that social construct. And you can't live up to that having ME. It's just impossible. And that, I think that shame that I felt over that was uh, the worst emotional aspect of this disease, is this shame that I felt. And then, of course, everybody is not being very sympathetic towards you because they're only seeing you at your best. So, it's just a bad place to be. So I've learned to not be so silent about it, being more open about my illness because of that. So people understand that, yeah, I am sick and there's nothing I can do about it.
And you've learned not to be so hard on yourself.
Yes.
Which is really part of the issue.
It is, definitely. I was I was brought up watching John Wayne movies, and that's the kind of man I was supposed to be. You get a job at the steel mill, and you raise a family, go to church on Sundays, and that's your life. And I was just too curious, and yeah, it just wasn't the thing for me. So
you deal with it.
Yeah. You find a path forward, and you move along.
And it is about learning, and it's always about education. And a lot of times when we find that we're not feeling very positive, if we don't grow and we don't learn, we never figure out ways to deal with it. And that sends us down a spiral that isn't good either.
Yes. Well,
so you talked about photography. So do you do photography now professionally or anything like that? Or what do you do in that regard?
Yeah, I do it in the classification that they call an enthusiast. So I don't typically make money on it, but I do have some decent equipment, about $5,000 of photography equipment. But professionals, I mean, the guys that do this professionally, they have 50, 100 grand in photography equipment. I mean, it's really expensive, way out of my budget. It's taken me 5 years to build up what I've got. So yeah, I do that. And the nice thing that I do with that is when we have family and friends that come out and visit us, I take pictures of their visit and all the places that we go to. And then for Christmas every year, we make these little books through Shutterfly. I just create these books and send it to them as a Christmas present to thank them, as more of a thank you for their visit and a little memory. And then I also do calendars that we send to all of our families, my wife's family, my family. So,
do you ever sell any of it, or is it all just basically for fun and to help you and reward you?
It's been more as a fun thing to do, and for me, it's personal enjoyment and that creative outlet. But I have several family members saying that I should try to make money at it, and I guess I'm going to look into it. I just haven't at this point because it's just been, it's something I enjoy doing. It's like if you enjoy walking on the beach, you just walk on the beach, right? So I enjoy photography. I just do photography.
Right.
So
you mentioned a little bit about the fact that you like to write and so on. Tell me more about that, if you would.
So in college, I started writing and being in poetry clubs, and I ended up on literary magazines of both colleges I went to. And so that really sort of stirred my desire to write, but you can't really make money at poetry. And to be honest, I'm not that great at poetry. I just love doing it as a personal exercise, expunging emotions and that sort of thing. But I ended up trying my hand at writing novels, and I've written 2 novels to date, and I'm currently working on a third of a trilogy. So, and my favorite genre has always been, I think one of my first books that I ever read was The Hobbit. So I love fantasy genres. So I wrote some fantasy books, but the thing that I did differently was I used my history background, especially my love of Minoan culture, as part of my world building. So I have these matriarchal cultures in my book that I that is the focus of the book. And so yeah, it's that's been really fun and rewarding.
So you published them, I assume. Did you do it yourself or do you have a publisher?
Self-published, just
Self-published.
Amazon. Just yeah, I don't really promote myself. I have a really hard time promoting myself on anything. I'm just not a salesperson at all.
Well, but if people like the books, there's probably some value in it. Are you selling some?
You know, I get these little trickle sales. So I get, like one, two, probably maybe 10 or 12 books sell a year, something like that. Not a lot, but it just kind of trickles in.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Everybody's reviewed it, loved it. So,
well, there's a message there somewhere, I would think.
Yeah. I think they're good books. So.
Well, and obviously, if you've had good reviews, somebody else does. So
yeah.
maybe you'll get some visibility because of our podcast, because we certainly will be glad to feature the book covers and so on as part of what we do, which is great. Love to do that. So when will your next one be finished?
It's so hard because the brain fog that I get from the ME is very prohibitive to writing creatively. So, and so I can't say for sure. I was hoping to actually have it done last year. So, it'd be nice if I could have it done by next summer, but there's no guarantee of that.
When was your first one published?
My first one was published in 2014, I think. And then my second one I published in 2017. So it's taken me about 4 years to write a book. So I'm a little overdue for my third book.
There you go. What was the name of the first one?
Guardians of the Grove, the Bowmaiden Chronicles.
Guardians of the Grove, Grove. Yep. Okay. Yep. And what was the second one?
Daughter of the Forest.
Okay. And the third one, we'll have to wait till it comes out.
Yeah, I haven't got a name for that yet because I kind of need to see how the story unfolds.
Well, that's actually an interesting topic because a lot of times I find in talking to writers, especially when they're dealing with fiction, sometimes you never know where the book's going to take you. The characters take over and it becomes perhaps a whole different thing than what you originally thought, but at the same time, it becomes a better thing than maybe what you thought.
Yeah. I mean, I had my core characters. My first thing that I did was I sat down with my core characters, like 4 main characters, and I mapped them out, what kind of personality they were going to have. And then the next thing I did was kind of build my my mythos of the world. So what was the religions, what's the politics and all of this. So when I was done with the world building, that's when I started writing. And you do realize that the structure that you gave that character in the beginning really dictates, if you're doing it organically at least, really dictates how they progress in the story. And things that you thought were going to work actually don't work, and you got to shift gears. And that, I didn't mind that. It's actually been kind of a rewarding thing to experience that, 'cause I didn't know that was, and I'm not sure if all writers experience that, but that's certainly been the case for me.
Well, and it's fun. I have not written fiction. I've written 2 books so far, and we just submitted a draft of a third one, but it's been nonfiction. I haven't figured out how to do, for me, fiction yet, and I just haven't come up with it. So maybe one of these days it will happen, because I think there's I love fiction, because in reality, fiction a lot of times is really an author speaking to us about their ideas and their attitudes and so on, and they use a fictional setting. But the reality is, it still is something that can teach us a whole lot.
Yeah. I think if you got strong characters, that's definitely the case. One of the things that really I had this character who was a mother whose husband gets killed early on. And I wasn't going to plan on doing anything. She was just more of a catalyst for my book. But, the feedback that I get got from that first book, everybody loved her character. So I had to rewrite her to continue her story arc through the whole series because she was so loved. So those things happen as well.
Again, a message, isn't it? Which is cool. Well, I know I'm excited to hear about the new one when it comes, and I will have to go hunt down the first two. You've published them as Kindle books. Have you created audio versions by any chance?
There's an audio version of the first book. Haven't got an audio version of the second book. I was going to use the same woman that did the first book, but I've lost the ability to get in touch with her. So I've got to find somebody to do that part for me, to orate it.
So is that first one on Audible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Well, I will go hunt it down. And I hope that you're able to get the second one done in an audio format as well. That will be fun. You don't want to leave people hanging,
Yeah, I know. That's everything I read. They said, if you're doing a trilogy like I'm doing, you don't really have good sales until you finish it, because nobody wants to start a series and end up like George Martin right now, where everybody's been waiting for over a decade for the book. It's so I get it. So hopefully I'll get them all out and get them all in audio here soon.
Yeah, well, George Martin had several books out, and of course, he also was fortunate to have a TV series come out of it too.
Oh yeah, he's an amazing writer, so a lot of respect there.
Yeah, so I love people with imaginations. I've been a Harry Potter fan, and I would love to see J.K. Rowling do something to continue that, although I don't know that she will. But, the original 7 books, and then there was a play, which I think wasn't really as imaginative as the first 7. Of course, she's also written under another name to publish some detective stories, and she's clearly a good writer.
Yeah, she's got an amazing story. Yeah, I love her work.
Yeah, she's very creative, and she does good mysteries. So when I can't figure out a mystery and we get to the end and I really didn't figure it out, I love that.
Yeah, it's hard to do these days.
It is. A lot of times I'm able to figure it out before the end when you're dealing with a mystery, but a good mystery is a puzzle, and maybe you can figure it out. So I enjoy figuring out because it really tests my brain, but then the ones where I don't figure it out, I can't say that I can complain about that, because obviously they did a good job. As long as when I go back and look at it afterward, I can see that the clues were really there to get it.
Right.
I just didn't, they didn't, I won't say hid them, but they put them in so well that you don't necessarily see it, which is
right,
cool.
Subtle. What really irritates me about other authors is when they take a character and to advance the plot, they make the character do something that's out of character.
Yeah.
Without a catalyst, right? When somebody's a very passive person and, something tragic happens and they become more aggressive, right? That's fine. But if nothing happens, they just all of a sudden become aggressive, then there's no reason for that, except you're trying to make the plot move. Your characters follow the plot instead of your characters driving the plot.
Or you're
Those
trying to
kind
do
of
it.
books are yeah.
Or you're trying to do it to sell.
Yeah.
And you think you got to do that. And good character analysis and good character development I would think, tell you not to just go off and change a character unless something, as you said, is a catalyst that makes it happen.
Yeah. The other thing that seems to be very big these days is love triangles, and I really get annoyed with those.
Yeah.
Some of them are done really well, and I enjoy them, but most of them, they're done or gag. They just seem to be forced, and it's just trying to create drama where it doesn't need to be.
I don't know whether I would call it a love triangle. Have you ever read any of the Stephanie Plum series, Janet Ivanovich?
I have not.
Stephanie Plum is she became a bounty hunter in Trenton, New Jersey. They're funny mysteries. They're really clever. And she has a guy that she's involved with, but then she's also working with another almost superhero type bounty hunter, Ranger, who likes her as well. It's not really a love triangle, but it's really fun to watch the byplay between all of these, the three of them. And there have now been 29 Stephanie Plum books, and they're absolutely hilarious. So if you want an escape, you should go read the Stephanie Plum series by Janet Ivanovich. They're really fun.
Stephanie Plum, huh?
That's her character. The first book is called One for the Money, and the second is Two for the Dough, and it goes from there. They're really funny. And she's kept it very well.
Yeah, one of my first humorous books that I've read was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, yes.
An old college buddy turned me onto that, and yeah, that was just hilarious. Just love the irreverent humor.
Do not abuse a mouse.
Yeah, that. And have you ever read Heinlein?
Oh, yes.
Robert Heinlein. Yeah, I don't think he would go over today very well. I mean, his stuff was pretty cutting edge for the time.
My favorite science fiction book still is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by him. I think it's the most imaginative book he wrote. I like it better than Stranger in a Strange Land. It's always been my favorite book since I first read it soon after it came out. And I didn't even realize at the time all about it, but I've read it a lot and absolutely enjoy it. It's one of my favorite books. So, well, it's my favorite book, my favorite science fiction book.
I always enjoyed the fact how in some of his books, he liked to kill off all the lawyers in the revolutions that he had.
Yes.
I always found that a little amusing.
Well, but the problem is they keep coming back.
Yeah.
So it's cool. Well, so what do you do today with your life and all that?
Just basically the photography, the little bit of work I do around here, around the apartment complex. And, we like to travel when I'm able. That's the big thing. We've got a big map down in the entryway into our apartment, and it's put all these little pins in it from all the different places we visited in Washington and Oregon. And so filling that map in has been my major endeavor these days.
What's the favorite place that you visited here or elsewhere in the world?
My favorite place in the whole world was probably Newgrange in Ireland.
Mm.
And that was phenomenal. That was really, really amazing.
How so?
So it's a giant tomb, this dome-shaped tomb, and you got this really narrow entrance into it, into this big rock chamber. So you got these huge monolithic rocks that have drawings on them and stuff, and then you work your way to the inside, and there's like these three separate chambers. And there, of course, we don't really know exactly what all this meant culturally to the time, because, we're talking thousands of years ago. But it's perfectly aligned with the winter solstice. So the light on the shortest day of the year shines directly into the back of the tomb and reflects into those three little chambers in there. And going in there and just sort of seeing all that and realizing that people from the Stone Age built this huge, huge structure. And it was just amazing. It predates the pyramids. So
have you ever happened to be there on December 21st?
No, I guess it's very, very difficult to get get a place in there on that date, because it's very tiny. To get in there, probably 20 people at the most could fit in there.
Well, of course, one has to ask, since you've been to Ireland and so on, did you kiss the Blarney Stone?
I went to the Blarney Stone, but I'm such a germaphobe, there was no way I was kissing it.
I hear you. I've been to Ireland. I did not kiss the Blarney Stone either. Nope, not going to do that. Too risky. I understand you have to be somewhat of a contortionist to do it anyway.
Yeah, you kind of have to lean down and stick your head into a hole or something, and I just no.
Yeah, I don't need that. That's okay.
No.
I think there are more important things to do. I loved Ireland. I very much enjoyed our 2 weeks there. I was there. Oh gosh, it's been since 2003. I was there to do some speaking for Irish guide dogs, and
that's the same year I was there.
It was a very enjoyable time. I loved it, and had haggis pie while I was in Ireland, and enjoyed it. But yeah, I liked Ireland.
We were planning because I'd been with my wife for about 5 years already, 6 years maybe, and um, her family really wanted some sort of traditional structure in our lives. So I was like, okay, let's just go get married. But I didn't want to have to deal with inviting family. So we decided to have a trip to Ireland, get married in Ireland, and do a honeymoon in Ireland. But you can't do that in Ireland because you got to be living in the county for 30 days prior to getting married. It's part of their laws.
Okay.
And so then I called England, the England section of UK, and I said, can we do that there? And they're like, no, there was like 20 days there. So then I called Scotland and called the town in Inverness in Scotland. They were like, yeah, just come on over, just have 2 witnesses and get married same day. They didn't have any problems with it. So that's what happens. We flew into Manchester, did a beeline to Scotland, got married, and then went over to Belfast and did our 2 weeks in Ireland.
I did a number of speeches over there. We actually had some interactions with Waterford. I have a statue it's actually a double statue. It was supposed to be a person and a dog, but they only had dogs at the time. But I have this whole very sophisticated platform that has two dogs facing each other. And then literally in print and in Braille, it says, as one, Mike and Roselle, who, of course, Roselle was the dog who was with me in the World Trade Center. And it's this nice Waterford crystal thing, which is really pretty cool.
Wow, that is nice.
Yeah, the Irish Guide Dogs people were very kind about that and setting that up. So it was wonderful to do that. I've not been to Scotland and I've not been to England, but I have been to Ireland. But I've been to New Zealand. I love New Zealand.
We thought about taking a trip to New Zealand, but after taking the trip to the UK, I realized that long plane flights do not agree with me. I was really my ME was just starting to come on, so I wasn't really bad yet, but that was really rough on my body. So I haven't done any long flights yet.
Now, I understand that you work with an organization, ME International.
Yes. One of the forums that I got hooked up with on the internet was ME International. There were a few others, a men's forum, and ME Advocacy is one of them. So anyway, so I got hooked up with them and was talking to one of the ladies on there, and she was helping me out with some vitamin supplements and whatnot, Colleen. And and one thing led to another, and they're like, well, you should join the board if you want. And so I joined the board and became a board member probably 8 months ago or something like that now.
So what do you do with them now?
So a sitting member of the board, and probably in January, there's going to be new officer positions. I'll probably fill in the role of the vice president at that time. And then the other thing that I do for them is maintain their website. I just recently did an upgrade to the website and updated it.
And that, of course, is how you got connected with Accessibe, as I understand it.
Yes. So we knew we wanted to have an app on there that helps people navigate the site, because one of the things with ME people is they tend to be very sensitive to bright colors, and so we were looking at how to manage that. I mean, the site itself is very pale, it's very subtle colors, but everybody's a little bit different, so we wanted to have an application that would handle that. And one of our board members from Australia, she recommended that I looked into Accessibe, and that called Accessibe, and they turned me on to talking to Sheldon, and and that turned out to be a great conversation, and we've been going with Accessibe ever since.
How's it been working out?
Good so far. I mean, everybody's been very happy with the site, very happy with the Accessibe program. Yeah, no complaints. It's all been positive so far.
Have you, well, do you put videos and other things like that on the website?
There are a few videos. They're more just information, uh, more than just visual, right? It's just more of a, but there are a few of them more about the history of the disease and how it's progressed over the years, our understanding of the disease.
Have you looked into working with Accessibility to address the issue of either having audio descriptions of the video parts that aren't necessarily discussed about, or for deaf and hard of hearing people, anything regarding closed captioning or captioning of the words so that people who can't hear it can also then at least read the text?
I haven't personally, but maybe Colleen or David might have done that because David's been talking to Sheldon too. But no, I have not, and they're the ones that put the video together, so I'm not really sure if that's in the progress or not.
Definitely worth looking at, because Accessibility has a whole department and a whole group of people under what you would find on the Accessibility website called Access Flow that can help with the things that the artificial intelligence widget itself doesn't do. So it would be good to really try to be inclusive with that stuff if the opportunity is there. I don't know
Definitely.
anything about how all that works in terms of costs for a nonprofit. And you bring up a good point that Me International, is it meinternational.org?
meinternational.org, yes.
Yeah. So the cost for using Accessibility isn't there, and I don't know how it works for the Access Flow stuff, but it would be worth exploring that to be sure to get the other inclusive parts up to make the website fully available.
Yeah, one of the things that we're working with
that.
right now is trying to get the different apps to make sure they're friendly with one another. Because
Right.
we're also, because we're international, trying to get the website translated. So we got a translation app, and it's not been as friendly as Accessibility. So we're trying to get all that stuff worked out at the moment. But it's having ME, I can't devote 40 hours a week to this. I have to do 4 or 5 hours here and there, and whenever I can. So
yeah. Well, I suggest you explore that with Sheldon. Let him do some of the heavy lifting to help, but he can get you in touch with the right people to explore that. But the whole idea is to make the website inclusive. And nowadays, it's becoming more of a relevant thing to try to make websites work for everyone. And of course, for us who happen to have a disability, as we know, even the CDC says 25% of all Americans have some sort of disability. So making the website available to 25% more people is always a good thing.
Yes, definitely.
And, there are a lot of opportunities. Well, I hope that it all works out. It's really exciting to hear that you're doing a lot already to make it usable and accessible. So what does ME International do exactly?
The main thrust of their mission is to educate, because there's been so much misunderstanding and misinformation about ME that including the name, like it was chronic fatigue, and at one time there was even this non-lethal AIDS, and there's been all these weird names attached to it over the years. And and chronic fatigue syndrome is still sort of around, even though it doesn't really define what's going on, because you can have chronic fatigue from any number of things, heart disease, cancer, etc. So that's very frowned upon, and in the ME community. So trying to get all of that parsed out where people can understand the disease in a way that makes sense to everybody, and to educate even the medical community, because there's not a lot in the textbooks yet about these illnesses. Now, I hope that's going to change since COVID, because now we're having a lot of post-viral illnesses crop up from COVID. Right. And I think the attitude in the medical community is starting to shift in a more positive way, and they're understanding these things a little bit better. So I'm hoping this dynamic will change. And that's really what we're trying to help move along.
What have you learned, or what would you counsel people on who may have ME or some sort of chronic illness like this? Because clearly you've experienced it, you've thought it through, and what kind of coaching would you give to people today? What have you learned about yourself?
You know, the main thing is to not be overwhelmed by the depression, because when you realize that you have an incurable illness and it impacts your life in a very drastic and profound way, you're not going to be the person you was before you this illness. You know, I used to hike across mountains and the Grand Canyon, you know, backpacked all over the place, and I can never do that again. And I realized that. But I might be able to go down to the park and hike around the pond for a day and then come home and rest for a couple of days, right? You just got to learn to live with it the best way, the best life that you can. And when you come to that realization, I think that really helps with a depression, because, you know, I read a statistic once that people with ME were 400% more likely to commit suicide than the national average. It's extremely high, and that overcoming that within these people, it would be, you know, that would be the big thing for me, is to let people know that there is hope out there. There are things you can do to improve your life. You may not have the life that you thought you were going to have, but you can have a life and enjoy your life. That would be my major thing that I'd want to get across.
I think that is as good a message as a body can have. You know, we grow up thinking we're going to do things, and so many times it doesn't necessarily go exactly the way we planned, but it also doesn't mean that you're not living at least as enriched a life as you had planned. And you may find that's a whole lot better than you thought.
Yeah, you can find meaning in life. It doesn't have to be the one that you thought you were going to have, for sure.
Well, James, I want to thank you for being here and inspiring us and giving us good life lessons, because I think it's important that we do that. And clearly you have learned to move forward, and that you continue to do things with your life. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the third book coming out, and you'll have to come back and tell us about that when it comes out. And well, you are absolutely welcome. Make no mistake about it. So we'd love to have you come back, but really appreciate you being here. And thank you for using Accessibility and just all the things that you're doing to contribute to life, because you are making a difference. And I hope that the things that you talked about today will help some other people who may be listening to Unstoppable Mindset.
Me too. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I want to thank you for listening to us today. I would love to hear from you, love to get your thoughts. Feel free to email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com, or you can go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast, or wherever you're listening to or watching the podcast today. Please give us a 5-star review. We really appreciate your reviews, and we appreciate your comments. So wherever you are, love to hear from you and appreciate all the things that you give us in the way of thoughts. And James, for you and for you who are listening out there, if you know of anyone else who we ought to have on Unstoppable Mindset, I would really appreciate you letting me know, and we'll interact with anyone that you suggest and see what we can do. But James, one last time, thank you very much for being here and for helping us show people they can be more unstoppable than they think they can.